The town that poisoned itself. Dear viewers, welcome to my channel. If you want to listen to a story that will help you learn something and help you sleep, then you can subscribe to this channel. Now, without further ado, let's go to the story. They called it a miracle of modern science. The doctors trusted it. The government approved it. Parents poured it into glasses every morning without hesitation. It was colorless, odorless, silent. And for nearly 40 years, it slowly poisoned an entire American city. This is the true story of how one of the wealthiest towns in America unknowingly drank industrial waste, and how the truth was buried beneath power, pride, and profit. In the years following World War II, America believed in progress. Factories expanded, suburbs multiplied. The American dream came with a lawn, a station wagon, and faith in science. Corporations were heroes of prosperity. Chemicals meant convenience. Innovation meant safety. No one questioned it. In 1947, the DuPont chemical plant along the Ohio River was booming. Teflon production was expanding rapidly. Non-stick cookware was becoming a household revolution. America loved convenience, and DuPont delivered it. Inside the Washington Works plant near Parkersburg, West Virginia, workers handled a synthetic chemical known internally as C8, perfluorooctanoic acid. It made Teflon possible. It also did something else. C8 did not break down in nature. It did not dissolve harmlessly. It did not disappear. It accumulated in soil, in water, in blood. But in 1947, almost no one knew that. Or perhaps more accurately, almost no one outside the company knew. For decades, wastewater from the plant flowed into the Ohio River. Sludge from production was dumped into open landfills. One particular landfill, Dry Run Landfill, would later become infamous. The residents of Parkersburg were proud of DuPont. It provided thousands of jobs, good salaries, stability. Families built their lives around it. The idea that the company might harm them was unthinkable. In 1961, DuPont's own internal scientists discovered something troubling. Laboratory animals exposed to C8 developed enlarged livers. The chemical persisted in blood. They kept studying. By 1978, they discovered C8 in the blood of plant workers. By 1981, pregnant workers exposed to C8 gave birth to babies with birth defects, eye deformities in particular. The company transferred female employees out of the Teflon division quietly. No public announcement was made. The Environmental Protection Agency was not informed immediately. The town kept drinking the water. The contamination did not begin with an explosion. There was no dramatic accident, no single day of disaster. It was slow, routine, invisible. Throughout the 1980s, DuPont continued discharging C8 into the Ohio River and into local landfills. The Dry Run landfill sat near farmland owned by the Tennant family. Wilbur Tennant was a stubborn cattle farmer. In 1998, his cows began dying. Not one or two, hundreds. Their teeth turned black. Tumors appeared on their hides. They staggered, foamed at the mouth, and collapsed. Wilbur filmed the dying animals with a camcorder. He was not a scientist, but he knew something was wrong. A small creek ran from DuPont's landfill directly into his pasture. The water sometimes ran strange colors. Wilbur Tennant did something dangerous in a town dependent on DuPont. He blamed the company publicly. Most lawyers in Parkersburg refused to take his case. Suing DuPont meant social exile. It meant attacking the economic heart of the community. Then Wilbur contacted an attorney named Robert Bilott. Bilott was not an environmental activist. He worked at a large corporate defense firm in Cincinnati. Ironically, he often defended chemical companies. But his grandmother knew the Tennant family. He agreed to look at the case. What he discovered would unravel one of the largest environmental cover-ups in American history. Bilott demanded internal documents from DuPont. Thousands of pages, memos, studies, blood tests, internal emails. What he read shocked him. By the early 1990s, DuPont knew C8 was present in drinking water supplies around Parkersburg. They knew it accumulated in human blood. They knew it caused cancer in lab animals. They had conducted secret blood tests on local residents without public disclosure. They estimated that C8 was in the blood of 99% of Americans at low levels. And still, they had not warned the public. The Environmental Protection Agency had no enforceable safety limit for C8. It was unregulated. In 2001, Bilott filed a federal lawsuit. The case did not explode immediately into headlines. It moved slowly, buried in court motions and legal maneuvering. Meanwhile, the water continued to flow. In Lubeck, West Virginia, residents drank from a water district drawing from contaminated groundwater. Families noticed clusters of disease, rare cancers, thyroid disorders, high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis. But correlation is difficult to prove, and corporations are powerful. In 2004, DuPont settled a class action lawsuit for $70 million, but the settlement required something unusual: a massive health study. Approximately 70,000 residents would have their blood tested. If independent scientists could prove a probable link between C8 exposure and specific diseases, DuPont would pay for medical monitoring. It was a risky agreement for DuPont. Between 2005 and 2013, scientists analyzed mountains of data. The results were historic. The C8 Science Panel found probable links between C8 exposure and kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, pregnancy-induced hypertension, high cholesterol. It was one of the most comprehensive environmental health investigations in American history. By then, C8 was found in the blood of nearly every American tested nationwide. The chemical had spread far beyond Parkersburg. Non-stick pans, waterproof clothing, food packaging, carpet treatments, firefighting foam used at military bases. C8 and related forever chemicals known as PFAS were everywhere. They were called forever chemicals because they do not naturally degrade. Ever. In 2015, DuPont spun off its chemicals division into a new company, Chemours. Legal responsibility became more complicated. Billions of dollars in settlements would eventually be paid. But the chemical remained in groundwater across the country. And this story was not unique. Across the United States, communities began discovering PFAS contamination in Michigan, New York, North Carolina, Colorado, California. Military bases, airports, industrial towns. The same pattern repeated. Approval, expansion, secrecy, discovery, denial, settlement. In 2019, the film Dark Waters dramatized Robert Bilott's fight. But even that movie could not fully capture the scale. More than 200 million Americans may be exposed to PFAS-contaminated drinking water. The chemicals are now linked in ongoing studies to immune suppression and developmental issues. And yet, these substances remain in countless consumer products. The town of Parkersburg did not vanish overnight. There was no dramatic collapse. Instead, there was something quieter. Trust eroded. Neighbors argued. Workers felt torn between livelihood and health. The American dream collided with industrial reality. The story forces uncomfortable questions. How many chemicals are in use today that will be tomorrow's scandal? How many internal memos sit in corporate archives right now? How many communities drink water they assume is safe? History does not always roar. Sometimes it dissolves slowly into a glass of water, and no one tastes it. The first thing Robert Bilott realized was that this was not an accident. It was a system. The documents did not describe confusion. They described calculation. Inside DuPont's Washington Works facility near Parkersburg, the chemical known as C8 had become essential to production. Without it, Teflon could not bond properly. Without Teflon, the booming cookware market would stall. By the late 1980s, non-stick cookware coated with Teflon was in millions of American kitchens. The brand had become synonymous with convenience. Ads promised freedom from scrubbing, freedom from sticking, freedom from worry. Inside corporate files, however, there was worry. Internal toxicology reports showed that C8 accumulated in human blood with a half-life of several years. That meant once it entered the body, it stayed there. Scientists inside the company noted something even more alarming. The chemical did not metabolize like typical toxins. The body did not recognize it as something to eliminate. It simply remained. By 1991, DuPont estimated that tens of thousands of pounds of C8 had been released into the environment around Parkersburg. The company installed filtration systems, but not before decades of discharge. Why not warn the public? The answer, buried in memos, was chillingly simple. There was no regulatory requirement to do so. At the time, the Environmental Protection Agency had no enforceable maximum contaminant level for C8. It was not classified as a hazardous substance under federal law. It existed in a gray zone of modern chemistry. Too new, too specialized, too profitable to be scrutinized, and so the town continued its routines. Children drank from school fountains. Mothers mixed baby formula with tap water. Workers showered after long shifts at the plant, unaware that the water itself carried microscopic remnants of the same chemical they handled on the factory floor. The science panel formed under the 2004 settlement began its work quietly. Blood samples were collected in community centers and trailers set up across West Virginia and Ohio. More than 69,000 people participated. It became one of the largest epidemiological studies in American history. The results did not arrive quickly. Data analysis took years. But as patterns emerged, they were impossible to ignore. Clusters of kidney cancer, unusual rates of testicular cancer, elevated cholesterol across broad populations, thyroid disorders appearing at disproportionate levels. The phrase, probable link, would become central to the legal battle. Not certainty, not absolute proof, but probable link. It was enough. Meanwhile, outside Parkersburg, the chemical had spread far beyond one town. In Minnesota, near facilities operated by 3M, the company that originally developed C8, groundwater contamination began surfacing in suburban communities. In Michigan, PFAS contamination appeared near military bases where firefighting foam had been used for decades. In North Carolina, the Cape Fear River carried a related compound downstream to hundreds of thousands of residents. Different names, different molecules, same family. PFAS, per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They shared one defining characteristic: the carbon-fluorine bond, one of the strongest in organic chemistry. It does not break down easily in nature. Rain does not wash it away. Sunlight does not destroy it. Time does not erase it. By 2010, researchers began detecting PFAS in polar bears in the Arctic, in dolphins off the coast of Florida, in rainwater samples. The contamination was global. Back in West Virginia, Robert Bilott continued digging. He discovered that in 1884, DuPont had conducted water tests showing elevated C8 levels in local drinking supplies, levels far higher than their own internal safety guidelines. They did not inform residents. They did not switch water sources immediately. They continued production. Corporate strategy documents discussed potential public relations risks. Messaging plans were drafted. Language was softened. The chemical was described as having no known human health effects. a technically careful phrase that avoided acknowledging uncertainty. Employees inside the plant faced a private moral dilemma. Many had worked there for generations. Their fathers and grandfathers had built the town's prosperity through those factory gates. To question the company felt like betrayal. To ignore the evidence felt like denial. At church gatherings and grocery stores, conversations became tense. Some residents supported the lawsuits. Others feared job losses. The town was divided. In 2012, after years of study, the C8 Science Panel officially confirmed probable links between exposure and 6 diseases. The announcement did not come with sirens. It came as a press release. But its implications were seismic. Under the settlement terms, DuPont was required to fund medical monitoring for affected residents. Eventually, the company would face thousands of individual lawsuits. By 2017, DuPont and Chemours agreed to pay $671 million to settle over 3,500 personal injury claims. It sounded like a massive number. But for a multinational corporation with billions in annual revenue, it was survivable. For families who had buried loved ones, the numbers felt abstract. A check does not restore a kidney. A settlement does not erase chemotherapy. And the contamination remained. Water filtration systems were installed. Activated carbon filters could reduce PFAS levels. But removal is complex and expensive. Many smaller communities across America could not afford it. In 2016, the EPA issued a non-enforceable health advisory level for certain PFAS chemicals in drinking water. Non-enforceable. Guidance, not law. Critics argue that regulation lagged decades behind science. Supporters claimed regulatory caution was necessary to avoid economic disruption. Meanwhile, blood tests continued to show PFAS in the vast majority of Americans. Researchers began studying immune system suppression in children. Vaccine response rates appeared slightly reduced in some exposed populations. As certain compounds were phased out, newer variants replaced them, marketed as safer alternatives. But safety data was often limited. The cycle repeated. Innovation, adoption, delay, discovery. By the early 2020s, investigative journalists began mapping contamination sites nationwide. Hundreds of locations. Airports, where firefighting foam seeped into soil. Textile plants, paper mills, industrial corridors. The problem was no longer a local scandal. It was national infrastructure. Communities from New Hampshire to California confronted the same realization Parkersburg had faced years earlier. Their water systems carried invisible history. In 2023, the EPA proposed the first enforceable federal drinking water standards for certain PFAS compounds. For many residents, it felt long overdue. For industry groups, it signaled massive compliance costs. The debate was no longer about whether PFAS existed. It was about who would pay to remove them and how many decades it would take. The story of Parkersburg forced a broader reckoning in America's relationship with chemical innovation. Since World War II, more than 80,000 synthetic chemicals have been introduced into commerce. Only a fraction have undergone long-term human health testing before widespread use. Most are regulated reactively, after harm is suspected, not before. History often celebrates industrial triumphs, but this chapter is quieter. It is about oversight gaps, legal thresholds, the space between not proven harmful and proven safe. In Parkersburg, the river still flows. Children still attend school. The town did not disappear, but its innocence did. The legacy of C8 is not just medical. It is philosophical. How much risk is acceptable in the name of progress? Who bears the risk? Burden, when profit and public health collide. And perhaps most unsettling, how many other chemicals are flowing right now, unnoticed, through pipes beneath American streets? The glass of water looks clear. It always did. If Parkersburg had been the only place, the story might have ended there. A tragic anomaly, a corporate scandal, a local failure. But as regulators and reporters began looking closer, they realized something unsettling. Parkersburg was not unique. It was simply early. In Michigan, residents near the former Wurtsmith Air Force Base began noticing strange warnings about their groundwater. For decades, firefighting crews had trained using aqueous film-forming foam, a substance designed to extinguish jet fuel fires instantly. The foam worked. It also contained PFAS. The chemical seeped into soil, from soil into groundwater, from groundwater into private wells. Families who had lived near the base for generations were told not to drink from their own taps. Fishing advisories were issued. Deer meat tested positive in some areas. The contamination had moved through the food chain. The foam had saved lives. It was essential for aviation safety. But its environmental cost was staggering. Across the country, similar discoveries unfolded. In New Hampshire, small towns found PFAS in municipal wells near manufacturing facilities. In New York, the village of Hoosick Falls detected contamination linked to a plastics plant. In North Carolina, residents downstream from a chemical facility learned that a newer compound, Gen X, had entered the Cape Fear River. Each time, the pattern felt familiar. Years of discharge, limited oversight, late discovery, community outrage. The companies involved often argued that they had followed existing regulations. In many cases, that was true. The problem was not always clear illegality. It was absence of regulation. American chemical policy had long relied on a framework established in 1976, the Toxic Substances Control Act. Under that law, chemicals already in commerce were largely grandfathered in without exhaustive safety testing. New chemicals required review, but regulators often lacked complete data. The burden frequently fell on agencies to prove harm, rather than on manufacturers to prove long-term safety conclusively. It was a system built for speed and economic growth, not for precaution. Meanwhile, scientific understanding evolved. Researchers began studying how PFAS molecules interact with proteins in human blood. Unlike many toxins that accumulate in fat tissue, PFAS bind to blood proteins circulating throughout the body. They have been detected in the liver, kidneys, and even umbilical cord blood. Studies suggested links to immune system suppression. Some data indicated reduced antibody response in children following routine vaccinations. The implications were subtle but profound. This was not acute poisoning. It was chronic exposure. Low doses, long timelines, population-wide impact. The chemicals were sometimes called ubiquitous contaminants. They had been found in rainwater, in remote regions, in Arctic wildlife, in the blood samples of people who had never lived near an industrial plant. In 2018, researchers published national biomonitoring data showing that the vast majority of Americans carried measurable levels of certain PFAS compounds in their bloodstream. The numbers were small, parts per billion, but persistence changes the equation. A substance that never degrades does not need high concentration to matter. Communities began organizing, town halls filled with anxious residents holding water bills and medical records. Grassroots advocacy groups formed across states. Parents demanded transparency. Veterans who had trained with firefighting foam spoke publicly about illness. The issue began reaching Congress. Lawmakers debated cleanup funding, liability rules, and whether PFAS should be designated as hazardous substances under federal law. Industry groups warned of sweeping economic consequences. PFAS were used in countless applications, from medical devices to semiconductors, from aerospace components to smartphones. Eliminating them overnight was impossible. The debate was no longer about a single company. It was about modern infrastructure. At the same time, filtration technology advanced. Engineers refined activated carbon systems and high-pressure membrane processes capable of reducing PFAS concentrations significantly. But filtration does not destroy the chemicals. It transfers them from water into waste streams that must still be managed. Scientists searched for destruction methods: high-temperature incineration, plasma treatment, electrochemical oxidation. Each approach carried cost and uncertainty. The deeper question lingered: how had this gone unnoticed for so long? Part of the answer lay in chemistry itself. The carbon-fluorine bond, central to PFAS stability, is extraordinarily strong. It resists heat, water, and oil. That is why it made non-stick pans slick and firefighting foam effective. It also made environmental breakdown nearly impossible. Another part of the answer lay in human psychology. When contamination is invisible, it does not trigger immediate fear. There is no smoke, no odor, no dramatic collapse, just data, charts, blood tests, statistics that accumulate slowly. In Parkersburg, years after the original lawsuits, some residents still struggled with conflicting emotions. DuPont had provided livelihoods. It had sponsored Little League teams. It had anchored the tax base. The town's identity was intertwined with the plant. Accountability felt necessary, but anger felt complicated. In 2019, the film Dark Waters brought national attention to the legal battle led by Robert Bilott. Audiences watched a dramatized version of one lawyer poring over documents late at night, uncovering truths hidden in technical language. For many Americans, it was the first time they heard the term forever chemicals. But for communities already living with contamination, the film was not revelation. It was confirmation. By the early 2020s, the Environmental Protection Agency moved toward establishing enforceable limits for certain PFAS compounds in drinking water. States began setting their own stricter standards in some cases. The regulatory tide was shifting, slowly. Yet even as certain compounds were phased out, replacement chemicals entered the market. They were shorter-chain PFAS, designed to move through the body more quickly. Early studies suggested they might be less bioaccumulative, but long-term data was limited. The cycle risked repeating itself. Innovation replacing innovation, assurance replacing assurance. In some ways, the story of PFAS mirrors earlier chapters of American industrial history. Asbestos was once praised for fire resistance. Lead was once common in gasoline and paint. PCBs were widely used in electrical equipment before their toxicity became undeniable. Each time, society learned through experience. Each time, regulation followed harm. The difference with PFAS is scale. They are not confined to one product category. They are embedded in modern life. Removing them entirely requires redesigning manufacturing processes, supply chains, and consumer expectations. It requires rethinking what convenience means. Costs. In Parkersburg, life continues. New filtration systems operate. Medical monitoring persists. Lawsuits have settled, but debates endure. The river still reflects the sky at dusk. Children still ride bicycles past houses built during the factory's boom years. From a distance, it looks like any other American town. But beneath the surface, in groundwater tables, in archived documents, in blood samples stored for research, history lingers. The story is not one of sudden catastrophe. It is a story of accumulation, of molecules, of data, of consequences. America's faith in progress has never disappeared, but it has been tempered. Now, when a new chemical enters the market promising revolutionary performance, some scientists ask harder questions. Some regulators demand more data. Some citizens read water quality reports more closely. Trust, once fractured, reforms slowly. The lesson of Parkersburg and the many towns that followed is not anti-science. It is not anti-industry. It is about vigilance, transparency, and humility in the face of innovation. Because sometimes the greatest dangers are not the ones that explode. They are the ones that persist. Clear, odorless, invisible, flowing quietly through a nation that believed it was safe. By the time America began confronting the scale of PFAS contamination, the rest of the world had already been exposed. The chemicals did not recognize borders. They traveled through exported products, through atmospheric circulation, through global supply chains. What began in industrial corridors along the Ohio River and in manufacturing plants in Minnesota had quietly become a planetary experiment. In Europe, regulators were watching the American lawsuits closely. The European Chemicals Agency began reviewing PFAS as a chemical class, rather than as isolated compounds. For decades, regulation had targeted individual molecules, banning one while allowing a slightly modified version to replace it. But PFAS were not just one molecule, they were thousands. Short chain, long chain, branched, linear, all bound by the same nearly indestructible carbon-fluorine backbone. European policymakers began discussing sweeping restrictions across the entire class. Industry leaders warned of massive disruption to manufacturing sectors, including aerospace, automotive engineering, renewable energy systems, and medical devices. The debate mirrored what was happening in the United States, only faster. In Sweden, researchers detected PFAS contamination in drinking water near airports, where firefighting foams had been used for decades. In Germany, farmland became contaminated after sewage sludge containing industrial residues was spread as fertilizer. In Italy's Veneto region, one of the largest PFAS groundwater contamination cases in Europe affected hundreds of thousands of residents. The pattern was familiar. Years of routine use, late discovery, expensive remediation. Back in the United States, attention turned increasingly toward military installations. For decades, aqueous film-forming foam, AAFF, had been the gold standard for extinguishing jet fuel fires. It could smother flames within seconds, preventing catastrophic explosions. The foam's effectiveness came from PFAS. From the 1970s onward, firefighting training exercises routinely sprayed thousands of gallons onto runways and practice fields. The foam soaked into soil, seeped downward, and entered aquifers beneath bases. Communities surrounding bases often relied on private wells. Many did not test regularly. Veterans began speaking publicly about health problems, cancers, autoimmune disorders, thyroid disease. Some connected their illnesses to years of exposure during training drills. The Department of Defense initiated investigations into contamination at hundreds of sites. Cleanup costs were projected in the billions. Replacing AFFF posed its own challenge. For years, alternatives were considered less effective in high-risk aviation environments. Safety and environmental protection collided once again. Congressional hearings examined whether the military had known about risks earlier. Documents showed awareness of environmental persistence dating back decades, though full health implications remained debated at the time. In civilian communities, lawsuits multiplied. Water utilities sued chemical manufacturers to recover filtration costs. States filed claims seeking compensation for environmental damage. Private plaintiffs alleged personal injury tied to long-term exposure. Legal strategies evolved. Instead of pursuing isolated claims, attorneys began arguing that PFAS should be treated as a unified chemical class with shared liability patterns. Courts wrestled with complex scientific testimony. Epidemiologists explained probabilistic risk. Toxicologists debated dose-response curves. Corporate lawyers emphasized regulatory compliance at the time of production. Juries were asked to weigh decades of corporate decision-making against evolving scientific standards. Settlements grew larger. In multiple states, major chemical manufacturers agreed to substantial payments to fund water treatment infrastructure. The figures reached into the billions. Yet money could not accelerate chemistry. Groundwater moves slowly. Aquifers flush over decades. PFAS concentrations decline gradually, even with filtration and source control. The chemical's nickname, forever chemicals, was not hyperbole. Researchers began asking deeper questions. If PFAS persist for centuries, what does that mean for intergenerational exposure? What does it mean for agricultural soil irrigated with contaminated water? What happens when biosolids from wastewater treatment plants, still containing PFAS, are spread on farmland? In Maine, dairy farms face devastating consequences when milk tested positive for high PFAS levels, traced back to sludge fertilizer used years earlier. Farmers who had followed state-approved practices suddenly found their livelihoods threatened. The issue was no longer confined to water. It had entered food systems. Insurance companies began evaluating environmental risk differently. Investors started scrutinizing corporate chemical portfolios. Environmental, social, and governance (ESG) metrics increasingly included PFAS exposure liability. Corporate boardrooms took notice. Some companies voluntarily phased out certain PFAS compounds. Others invested heavily in research for alternative materials. Innovation, once the source of the problem, was now tasked with solving it. In 2023 and 2024, regulatory momentum accelerated in the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency finalized enforceable drinking water standards for specific PFAS compounds, setting maximum contaminant levels measured in parts per trillion. Among the strictest standards ever issued for drinking water contaminants, public water systems nationwide began compliance planning. Testing expanded. Transparency increased. For communities like Parkersburg, the new rules felt both validating and bittersweet. Validation, because federal standards acknowledged the seriousness of the threat. Bittersweet, because decades had already passed. Children born during peak contamination years were now adults. Some had developed illnesses, some had not. All carried a history written in molecular traces. International cooperation intensified. Scientists across continents shared biomonitoring data. Research conferences focused on destruction technologies capable of breaking the carbon-fluorine bond, something once thought nearly impossible outside specialized laboratory conditions. Emerging methods showed promise. Supercritical water oxidation, plasma reactors, advanced electrochemical systems. Each represented a race against permanence. The broader philosophical reckoning deepened. Modern life is built on materials engineered for durability, stain resistance, heat resistance, corrosion resistance. PFAS exemplified that pursuit. They delivered on performance. They failed on persistence. The story's tension lies not in villainy alone, but in trade-offs misunderstood. In the mid-20th century, few imagined that a molecule designed to keep eggs from sticking to a pan could travel globally, accumulate in bloodstreams, and remain for generations. Scientific foresight was limited. Transparency was inconsistent. Regulatory systems were reactive. The cost was cumulative. Today, American parents check annual water quality reports with greater scrutiny. Activists advocate for precautionary chemical policies. Researchers push for green chemistry, designing substances that degrade safely after use. The phrase "forever chemical" has entered public vocabulary, but the chemicals themselves remain. In river sediments, in polar ice cores, in archived blood samples stored in freezers for future study. History often remembers disasters by singular moments, explosions, spills, collapses. The PFAS crisis defies that narrative. It is a slow event, a distributed event, an accumulation rather than an accident. In Parkersburg, the factory still stands. Production methods have changed. Controls have tightened. Corporate structures have shifted. but the legacy persists in both infrastructure and memory. Residents who once trusted without question now ask for data. Regulators who once lacked authority now wield stricter standards. Scientists who once studied isolated toxicity now examine systemic persistence. The United States continues balancing innovation with oversight. The world watches, because the lesson extends beyond one chemical family. It asks a universal question: how do we measure progress? By convenience, by profit, by durability, or by the ability to undo what we create? The Ohio River flows past Parkersburg as it always has. Indifferent, reflective, constant. Water moves forward, chemistry lingers, and history, once dissolved into a glass without taste or color, now stands visible. A reminder that what seems harmless today may define tomorrow.